So now in this truly final lecture, we're going to talk about some more things that influence the amount of force that a whole muscle can produce. We're going to talk briefly about different muscle fiber types, which I've done to some degree, but very, very little already. And finally, we'll talk about different types of contractions. So a couple more things that will determine the amount of force that a whole muscle can produce. The length of the muscle is another thing that will determine the amount of force that it can produce in a given circumstance. So imagine the biceps muscle. If the biceps muscle is very stretched out, in order to produce, in order to stretch the biceps muscle, you would have to go into pretty extreme elbow extension, right? Here's the biceps muscle. Here's the tendon attaching to the radius. You can see in my stick figure that the elbow is fully extended, and thus the biceps muscle is very stretched. When the biceps muscle is very, very stretched out, what is the biceps muscle made up of? The biceps muscle is made up of muscle fibers. What are the muscle fibers made up of? Myofibrils. What are the myofibrils made up of? Sarcomeres. The point is, if you have a very stretched out muscle, then you have very stretched out muscle fibers, and thus you have very stretched out myofibrils, which means you have very stretched out sarcomeres. When a muscle is very stretched, the sarcomeres within all the muscle fibers are very stretched because the whole muscle is stretched. And that means there's very little overlap of myosin and actin. So when you ask a muscle to contract, when it's very, very stretched, it actually can't produce that much force because there's not a lot of overlap of myosin and actin. So there's not much interaction between myosin and actin, and force is proportional to the amount of myosin heads that are bound to actin. And if you have all these sarcomeres that are very, very stretched out, like in this image right here, then there's not that much overlap between myosin and actin, and not much myosin and actin can interact, and not very much force can be produced. And you can very easily prove this to yourself. Take your biceps muscle, right, and stretch it out as much as you can. Go into extreme elbow extension, and then try to flex your biceps. You shouldn't say flex because the elbow is what flexes. I know people say that, but that's not a correct term. So take your elbow, extend it out as much as you possibly can. Go into full elbow extension, and then contract your biceps muscle as much as possible, right? It's not actually going to produce very much force. And you have to take this one by one to make sense of this and to fully understand it. So now take your elbow and go into extreme elbow flexion. Flex your elbow as much as you possibly can, right? In that case, if we were flexing the elbow as much as we possibly could, here again is our stick figure. Okay, we're gonna have a very bunched up biceps muscle here. Go into extreme elbow flexion, as much elbow flexion as you can possibly get. And what'll happen is the biceps muscle will be so shortened, so balled up when you go into extreme elbow flexion, right? Because if elbow extension causes the muscle to be overly stretched, because that's what stretches the biceps muscle, then if you go into extreme elbow flexion, the biceps muscle is going to be incredibly shortened, right? As much as it can be. And if the biceps muscle is incredibly shortened, what's the biceps muscle made up of? Muscle fibers. What are the muscle fibers made up of? Myofibrils. What are the myofibrils made up of? Sarcomeres. The sarcomeres within the biceps muscle fibers will be incredibly shortened. And they'll be so shortened that we actually think that the actin filaments cross over into the adjacent parts of the sarcomere. Okay, the actin filament on the left side will actually cross over into the right side, and the actin filament on the right side will actually cross over into the sarcomere onto the left side. And we think that this actually causes, as you can see in the image, kind of double overlap of the actin filaments. And when the actin filaments are, we think, double overlapped, what that does is anywhere that there's double overlapped, myosin and actin actually can't interact with each other in that area. So yet again, this whole central region of the sarcomere can't produce force because the sarcomeres are way too shortened, because the biceps muscle as a whole is way too shortened due to this extreme elbow flexion. And this extreme shortening of the sarcomeres is causing double overlap of the actin filaments, and it's preventing myosin and actin from interacting anywhere that there is double overlap. And yet again, because force is proportional to the amount of myosin bound to actin, not as much force can be generated in this circumstance where the muscle is overly shortened and thus the sarcomeres are overly shortened. And to prove this to you, move your elbow into full flexion, flex it as much as you possibly can, and then try to contract your biceps muscle. You won't be able to actually produce that much force, because all the muscle fibers within the biceps muscle are overly shortened, thus the sarcomeres within them we think are overly shortened, and overly shortened sarcomeres produce submaximal force because myosin and actin can't interact with each other in those double overlapped areas of actin. So what then would allow for, kind of the most amount of force to be generated? At what length? The answer is somewhere in between. And in the case of the biceps muscle, it's at about 90 degrees of elbow flexion. At about 90 degrees of elbow flexion, the biceps muscle is not overly shortened, not overly lengthened, stretched out, right? It's just kind of at this perfect length when the elbow is at 90 degrees, so that the sarcomeres within the biceps muscle fibers are just perfectly overlapped. They're perfectly overlapped, and that enables the maximal amount of myosin and actin to be able to interact with each other, and that then allows for the maximal amount of force to be generated. This is really true for every muscle. Every muscle, if it's overly stretched, it'll produce submaximal force. If it's overly shortened, it'll produce submaximal force. It needs to be right in between being fully stretched and fully shortened in order for that muscle as a whole to generate the most force. And it's because at that length, in between being fully stretched and fully shortened, like with the biceps muscle when the elbow is at 90 degrees, like I'm trying to poorly draw in this image right here, at that length, the sarcomeres within all the muscle fibers within the biceps muscle, not all of them, but most of them, the sarcomeres within those biceps muscle fibers are overlapped optimally so that myosin and actin are, again, you can see it here too. You can see that the sarcomeres are optimally overlapped and the most amount of myosin and actin can interact, and thus the most amount of force can be generated. This as a whole is known as the length-tension relationship or length-force relationship. It basically says what's the length of a muscle where it will produce the most amount of force. And it's always in between, somewhere between, where the muscle would be fully stretched, fully lengthened, and fully shortened, right? In between those two is typically where the muscle will be able to generate the most amount of force. And you can so easily measure this, with a force transducer. You can have somebody go into extreme elbow extension, where the biceps muscle is really, really stretched, and have them produce the most amount of force, contract the biceps muscle as much as possible, and you can measure the amount of force they can produce. You can have them go into full elbow flexion, and then have them contract the biceps muscle as forcefully as they can, measure the amount of force they can produce, and then have them do about 90 degrees of elbow flexion, and ask them to contract their biceps muscle as forcefully as they can, and measure the force. And you'll see at 90 degrees, by far, that is when the biceps muscle can produce the most amount of force as a whole. And again, we all think it comes back to the length of the sarcomeres within the biceps muscle fibers when the elbow is at 90 degrees, right? The sarcomeres are optimally overlapped and the most amount of myosin and actin can interact. The next thing that we're going to discuss here is the force-velocity relationship. Also can be called the tension-velocity relationship. Doesn't matter ultimately. What it recognizes is something very, very important about skeletal muscle fibers. And that is, generally, the faster that they shorten, the less force they can produce. And first of all, let's make sense of this logically and then discuss the mechanism behind it. So on the surface level, the force-velocity relationship is incredibly obvious. And let me explain why. So imagine that you are trying to do a squat like she is in this image. And you're trying to do as much weight as you possibly can for one repetition. I imagine that is what she is doing here as well, right? Something like a 1 rep max. That's usually how powerlifting meets go. Okay, so you're doing as much weight as you can for one repetition. Now imagine the speed at which you do that one repetition. Is it fast or is it slow? Everybody is immediately going to know the answer to this, which is it's very slow. Just imagine trying to pick up something very heavy, right? Your muscle, while you pick up that very, very heavy object, shortens at a very, very slow velocity. We know that if we want muscle fibers, and thus whole muscles, to generate lots of force to lift very heavy objects, we need them to shorten slowly, right? This is the force-velocity relationship. It tells us that the muscle produces the most amount of force when it shortens the slowest. In fact, it'll produce the most force when it doesn't shorten at all, called an isometric contraction. Now, the faster the muscle fiber shortens, the less force it will produce. And that can be very easily explained with this image right here, right? Imagine trying to do a 1 rep max, like she's doing in this meet right here. And then imagine trying to do a 1 rep max, as much weight as you possibly can do, with a squat one time. And then do it at the speed at which you'd run a sprint. Right? Immediately, you'd say that's just silly. Of course, that can't be done, right? If you tried to lift as much weight as you possibly could, but, at the same time, shortened your quadricep and hamstring muscle fibers at the same rate that would happen when you were sprinting, obviously, immediately, I think most of you would probably come to the conclusion that's ridiculous, right? That can't be done. And the reason is because when muscle fibers shorten really fast, like when we're doing a sprint, for example, they lose their ability to generate lots of force, because the faster a muscle fiber and thus a muscle shortens, the less force it can produce. And that might lend itself, that point, to an obvious question, which is, aren't we trying to generate lots of force when we run a sprint? And the answer is absolutely. You're trying to get your muscle fibers within your quadricep, hamstring muscles, gluteal muscles, etc., to generate as much force as possible. But you're also trying to get them to shorten as fast as possible. And we know as the muscle fibers shorten faster, they generate less force. And then that leads into a whole different topic that's well outside of the scope of this class, which is really a conversation about a concept called power, which is trying to be able to generate as much force over a short period of time. And to have that conversation, you of course need to, one of the most important parts of it is acknowledging the force-velocity relationship. And of course, the whole idea is how can, what muscle fiber types do this? How do we train for this? How do we get muscle fibers to generate as much force as possible while they're shortening fast when we know that they can produce less force? Again, these are questions that are outside of the realm of this class, but if that popped into your head, it's a very good question. It just is answered in a course that is not this one. So the force-velocity relationship, one more time, is relatively easy. It's just the faster that muscle fibers shorten, the less force they can produce, right? And you can tie all that together by thinking about lifting heavier and lighter objects, and the speed at which the muscle fibers can shorten while they perform those activities, just like we did with the 1 rep max on the squat with the image of the power lifter. Okay, so what about the actual physiological explanation for this? Why, when muscle fibers shorten faster, do they generate less force? And we're not 100% certain, but there are some explanations that make somewhat some degree of sense, let's say. Since this is the force-velocity relationship, right, what has the ability to shorten? Well, sarcomeres within myofibrils that exist within muscle fibers. So here's a sarcomere. What has the ability to generate force? The interaction of myosin and actin. That's where force is generated without question. So what about the sarcomeres shortening faster would cause less force to be produced? And some of this just isn't clear. And some of the theories, like many things, we don't have time to get into all the different possibilities. And some of the stuff we just haven't discussed enough to be able to have the sort of in-depth conversation about this that's necessary. So the basic explanation for this would be that when the sarcomeres shorten at a very high velocity, right? That means actin is moving over myosin at a very fast rate, right? That's a fast shortening velocity. Okay. The idea is the faster that the actin filaments move over the myosin filaments, the less time there is for the myosin heads, certain myosin heads, to be able to interact with the actin filaments. So let me say that again. Imagine this actin filament is moving over this myosin filament at a really rapid pace. Because of the speed at which the actin filament is moving past the myosin filament, there's less time for myosin heads to be able to interact with actin. Force is proportional to the number of myosin heads bound to actin. The more myosin heads you have bound to actin, the more force that you produce. This, yet again, is something that we know. So in theory, if the actin filament moves over the myosin filament at a really high velocity, right, a really fast rate, then there would be less time for myosin heads to actually be able to interact with the actin filaments. And since force is proportional to the number of myosin heads bound to actin, this would translate into a reduction in force production when the sarcomeres are shortening at a high velocity. Now, if the actin filaments move over the myosin filaments at a very slow rate, in theory, this would give more myosin heads an opportunity to bind to the actin filament, and thus more force would be produced. You have to realize within like a myosin filament here, there's going to be thousands of myosin heads. Okay, all of the thousands of myosin heads have the capability to bind to actin and generate force. And if the actin filament just rips over the myosin filament, less of those myosin heads over time are going to be able to bind to the actin filament due to the speed at which the actin filament is traveling past the myosin filament. Now, if you let the actin filament move past the myosin filament very, very slowly, the idea is since there's more time, there's more opportunities for more myosin heads to bind to more actin and generate more force. Now, there are many problems with this theory. There's probably much more to this than what I'm mentioning here, but on a surface level, it does make a decent amount of sense. So again, imagine you're about to lift a very heavy object. What you would need is the muscle fibers within the muscle that you're about to use to contract to lift the object. You would need the muscle fibers within that muscle to shorten very slowly, because if they shorten slowly, that means that the actin filaments would move over the myosin filaments very slowly, and thus more myosin heads would be able to bind to actin, and those muscle fibers thus would be able to generate force, because force is proportional to the amount of myosin bound to actin. And thus, if the muscle fibers can generate more force, then the whole muscle generates more force, and you're able to lift that heavier object, albeit you're lifting that heavier object with your muscle, and thus muscle fibers within that muscle, shortening at a very slow velocity. If you tried to lift that same very, very heavy object and simultaneously tried to shorten the muscle fibers within that muscle that's about to contract, if you tried to shorten those muscle fibers at a really rapid velocity, then the muscle fibers would be able to generate less force, because the actin filaments would move over the myosin filaments so fast that less myosin heads will be able to bind to actin, and thus the muscle fibers would generate less force. And since they'd be generating less force, you wouldn't be able to lift that very heavy object if your muscle fibers were shortening at this very high velocity, because the muscle fibers just wouldn't be able to generate enough force. So now you've seen everything that's necessary to discuss what will dictate the amount of force that a whole muscle can produce. We're not going to go back through them all, obviously, but I just want to point this out to you because it's always much more complex than anybody thinks it is, or tries to make it out to be. So when you think about how much force a whole muscle can produce, you have to be thinking about the size principle. That's a huge one. Maybe the most important, right? How many muscle fibers within that whole muscle are actually generating force? If there's very few muscle fibers contracting due to few alpha motor neurons generating action potentials, then the muscle isn't going to generate a lot of force. If there are lots of muscle fibers contracting due to a high quantity of alpha motor neurons generating action potentials, then the muscle is going to generate more force. You also have to be thinking about, are the muscle fibers that are contracting within that muscle in a state of tetanus? I said the smaller, slower twitch ones tend to be activated and put immediately into a state of tetanus, but the larger muscle fibers, oftentimes when they're initially activated, are not in a state of tetanus. So that can have an influence over how much force a whole muscle produces. Not only how many muscle fibers are contracting within the muscle, but also, are all the muscle fibers that are contracting within that muscle in a state of tetanus? If they're not, then the muscle isn't generating as much force as it could. Meaning that if you were to get all the muscle fibers into a state of tetanus within that muscle, if all the muscle fibers are generating maximum force, then the muscle is going to be able, as a whole, is going to be able to generate more force. You also have to be thinking about what's the length of the muscle. Right? If the muscle is really stretched out and lengthened, then it can't generate as much force due to stretched out sarcomeres. If the muscle is very shortened, then the muscle can't generate a ton of force because it's overly shortened and the sarcomeres are shortened, and they also can't generate as much force in that position due to the overlap of actin filaments. So you have to be taking into consideration what's the length of the muscle, and thus the length of the sarcomeres within the muscle fibers within that muscle. So that's another consideration that you have to make. What about the force-velocity relationship? What's the speed at which the muscle is shortening? If the muscle is shortening at a fast or high velocity, then you know that the whole muscle isn't going to generate as much force, because the individual muscle fibers are shortening very fast, and the actin filaments are moving over the myosin filaments at a fast rate. Less myosin and actin are interacting, so thus less force is generated simply due to the fact that the whole muscle, and thus the muscle fibers, are shortening very quickly. Now, if the whole muscle and thus muscle fibers are shortening more slowly, then you'll get a greater force production, because the muscle fibers themselves will generate more force due to the actin filaments moving over the myosin filaments very slowly. These are all factors you have to take into consideration when you're talking about how much force a muscle can produce in a given circumstance. You have to consider every single one of these not just one of these on their own, right? Each one of these is important on their own, but there's much more to consider than just one of these. You have to be thinking about actually all of these simultaneously. And the last thing that you have to take into consideration with regard to force production and many other variables that we won't discuss in this course, the last thing that you have to take into consideration is what's the proportion of slow to fast twitch muscle fibers within that whole muscle. So now we're going to delve into a little bit of a conversation about the differences, although this is going to be very light, the differences between what are called slow and fast twitch muscle fibers. And hopefully then you can also think about how that contributes significantly to this equation as well, right? The number of fast to slow twitch muscle fibers within a whole muscle will have an influence on force production, certainly in different circumstances. And it will also have an influence on many other things as well. So first things first, if you were to take a biopsy of muscle out of any whole muscle in your body, so quadricep, hamstring, deltoid, calf, trap, lat, whatever, pick any whole muscle and take a biopsy from it. And if you were to look at what that biopsy consisted of course, it would be mostly muscle fibers, right? Because what are whole muscles made up of? They're made of muscle fibers. But then, if you were to stain those biopsies, with something called hematoxylin and eosin, you would be able to see that those biopsies were made up of very different types of muscle fibers. Some of the muscle fibers would show up as darker, some of them would show up as lighter, some of them would kind of show up as in between. And what you would actually be looking at is you'd be looking at different muscle fiber types, as they're called. Inside of any whole muscle, you're going to find lots of muscle fibers, but there's something else, and that is there are different muscle fiber types that exist within every whole muscle. Generally speaking, there are two categories. There are what are called fast twitch muscle fibers, and there are what are called slow twitch muscle fibers. And there are many in between. We actually now know through research that there's about at least 15 different types of muscle fibers. That's quite clear. But usually what's discussed in like an exercise physiology course are three different types. I'm not even going to get into that type of depth here. I'm just going to differentiate between what are called fast and slow twitch muscle fibers. Like, what's the basic difference between these fast and slow twitch muscle fibers? And every whole muscle within your body is going to have some combination of fast and slow twitch muscle fibers. So for example, in postural muscles, for example, like the soleus, and some of the erector muscles, you would, in every single person, you'd find a higher percentage of slow twitch muscle fibers than you would fast twitch muscle fibers. That'd be true across the board. Right? And then in other muscles, like the pectoralis major, you would find a higher quantity of fast twitch muscle fibers than you would of slow twitch muscle fibers. And that would be true across the board, yet again. But the proportions would be different from person to person. So for example, we say everybody would have a higher proportion of slow twitch muscle fibers within their soleus than fast twitch muscle fibers. But some people would have a much higher percentage of slow and a much lower percentage of fast than somebody else, who might have a higher percentage of fast than the other person and a lower percentage of slow compared to that person. Yet again, here's person one, here's person two. Person number one, we're going to acknowledge that this is the soleus muscle. So across the board, everybody is going to have a higher percentage of slow. Let's say person number one has 80% slow and 20% fast. But then you would compare this to the next person. There's the F, by the way. You were to compare this to the next person, person number two. Maybe they've got 75% slow and 25% fast. Okay? So both these people have a higher percentage of slow twitch muscle fibers within their soleus muscle than they do fast. But when you actually compare one person to the next, you notice, right, there are individual differences. Not everybody is 80-20. Right? Some people are 80% slow and 20% fast, and then other people might be 90% slow and 10% fast. Okay? So there are huge differences in this comparison that exists across the population of individuals. And ultimately, this difference is really what we know determines much of athletic capacity. There are tons of intangibles that you have to take into consideration, but the difference in slow to fast twitch muscle fibers within different muscles of the body has a huge influence over that person's athletic capabilities. So you could reverse this, for example, and you could look at person number 1 and person number 2, and you could take a biopsy of their pec muscle yet again. There'd be a higher percentage of fast than there would be slow, but there would be differences in the amount of fast to slow twitch muscle fibers in person 1 versus person 2, which would have a big influence over their ability to perform in sports. So I keep going on about this, and now let's actually try to explain why that would be the case. So what we need to do first here is just define the difference with regard to fast and slow twitch muscle fibers. Where does the term fast and slow come from? Okay. Fast twitch muscle fibers mean that the muscle fibers can shorten at a very fast or high velocity. Right? Fast twitch muscle fibers can shorten very, very fast. Slow twitch muscle fibers, on the other hand, shorten very slowly. Right? Their shortening velocity is very slow or low. Okay? That is the difference. The major difference between fast and slow twitch muscle fibers, fast and slow just means the rate of shortening. Right? If the rate of shortening is very fast, meaning that the muscle fibers can shorten at a fast or high velocity, then they're called fast twitch muscle fibers. If the rate of shortening is slow, meaning that the muscle fibers shorten at a slow or low velocity, we call them slow twitch muscle fibers. So we've established what the major difference is between fast and slow twitch muscle fibers, right? Fast twitch muscle fibers can shorten at much faster velocities than slow twitch muscle fibers can, which shorten at slow velocities. Okay. But physiologically, we haven't addressed at all what accounts for the difference between the fast and the slow twitch muscle fibers to allow for this. And we know that the answer is related to the myosin heads that exist within fast twitch muscle fibers compared to the myosin heads that exist within slow twitch muscle fibers. And here's what we know. We know that the myosin heads within fast twitch muscle fibers can cycle at higher frequencies than the myosin heads that exist within slow twitch muscle fibers. So let's say that this is a myosin head, couple myosin heads that exist within a fast twitch muscle fiber, and let's say that these are the myosin heads that exist within a slow twitch muscle fiber. All right. So the myosin heads within this fast twitch muscle fiber can cycle 100 times over the course of a second. And the myosin heads within this slow twitch muscle fiber can cycle 50 times over the course of a second. We know that this is generally true when we compare fast and slow twitch muscle fibers. We've established this quite definitively in the lab setting, which is myosin heads within fast twitch fibers can cycle at higher frequencies than the myosin heads within slow twitch muscle fibers. And this easily accounts for why fast twitch muscle fibers can shorten faster than slow twitch muscle fibers can. Because, again, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of myosin heads that exist within one muscle fiber. Okay? But then you compare a fast twitch fiber to a slow twitch fiber, and you say all the myosin heads within the fast twitch fiber can cycle 100 times over the course of a second. And all the myosin heads within a slow twitch muscle fiber can cycle 50 times over the course of a second. And if I haven't been clear enough, what I mean by cycle is like one ultimately cross-bridge cycle, right? So the myosin head cycles, swivels one time, right, back and forth. Okay, so the myosin heads within the fast twitch fiber can cycle 100 times over the course of a second, and the myosin heads within the slow twitch fiber can cycle 50 times over the course of a second. Okay, if all the myosin heads within a fast twitch fiber, muscle fiber, are cycling 100 times over the course of a second, then the actin filaments within the fast twitch fiber are going to be moving towards the M line much, much faster compared to the slow twitch muscle fiber, right? Because the myosin heads within the fast twitch fiber are cycling 100 times over the course of a second, and thus each myosin head is pulling actin towards the M line 100 times over the course of a second. So thus the fast twitch fibers, they shorten very, very fast because the myosin heads cycle at such a high frequency. And then you compare this to the slow twitch muscle fibers. And inside of the slow twitch muscle fibers, you have these myosin heads that cycle at much lower frequencies, 50 times a second in my example. If the myosin heads in the slow twitch muscle fibers are only cycling 50 times over the course of a second, then they're only pulling actin towards the M line 50 times over the course of a second. And of course, then, actin is going to move towards the M line at a much slower rate in the slow twitch muscle fibers, and thus the overall shortening velocity of the sarcomeres, and then thus the whole slow twitch muscle fiber, is going to be much slower. So let's do a side-by-side here. Okay, this is one sarcomere within one myofibril located within a fast twitch fiber, right? F, that's the one on the top. Okay. On the bottom, this is one sarcomere within one myofibril of a slow twitch muscle fiber. Okay. And we know that within the fast twitch muscle fiber, the fast twitch muscle fiber shortens a lot faster than the slow twitch muscle fiber does, and it's because the sarcomeres within the fast twitch fiber shorten so much faster than the sarcomeres within the slow twitch muscle fiber. So why is that? What accounts for that? And the answer comes down to the myosin heads, right, we think. So within the fast twitch muscle fiber, in my example, I said these myosin heads have the capacity, right, not the capacity, but they can cycle 100 times over the course of a second. Okay. And in the slow twitch muscle fiber, the myosin heads can cycle 50 times over the course of a second. So let's say this a little bit more accurately this time. That means in the fast twitch muscle fiber, the myosin heads, theoretically, although this doesn't happen 100% of the time, like you can already figure this out from the force-velocity relationship, but these myosin heads, in theory, have the ability to interact with the actin filament 100 times over the course of a second, right? In the fast twitch muscle fiber, the myosin heads can cycle 100 times over the course of a second. Thus, in theory, they could theoretically interact with the actin filament and pull the actin filament towards the M line 100 times over the course of a second. You compare that to the slow twitch muscle fiber. Inside of the slow twitch muscle fiber, the myosin heads can only cycle 50 times over the course of a second. So theoretically, these myosin heads within the slow twitch muscle fiber can only interact with actin 50 times over the course of a second, and thus it has the theoretical capability to pull the actin filament 50 times over the course of a second towards the M line. And I think you can look at this and immediately figure out, well, which sarcomere and thus which muscle fiber is going to shorten faster. Okay. Well, if in the fast twitch fiber, the myosin heads can cycle 100 times over the course of a second, all of the myosin heads, right, all of these myosin heads can cycle 100 times over the course of a second. That means every single one of them has the ability to pull actin approximately 100 times over the course of a second towards the M line, right? That means that in the fast twitch fiber, the sarcomeres are going to shorten way faster because each myosin head has the ability to cycle 100 times over the course of a second and pull actin towards the M line 100 times over the course of a second. And you compare that to the slow twitch fiber. And the slow twitch fiber has these myosin heads that can only cycle at half the rate, right? Every myosin head within this slow twitch muscle fiber can only cycle at half the rate, half the frequency compared to the fast twitch muscle fiber. All the myosin heads can only cycle 50 times over the course of a second. They only have the theoretical ability to interact with actin 50 times over the course of a second. And if they can only cycle 50 times over the course of a second, then actin in the slow twitch fiber is going to be pulled towards the M line at a much, much slower rate, half the rate. Right? The shortening velocity in my example with this slow twitch muscle fiber is going to be half the rate compared to the fast twitch muscle fiber. So this is the major thing that we know about fast versus slow twitch muscle fibers, right? Obviously, we can see in a lab setting that the fast twitch muscle fiber shortens way faster than the slow twitch muscle fiber does. Their shortening velocities are vastly different. But of course, the other thing that we're very interested in is what's the physiological explanation for why a fast twitch muscle fiber can shorten so much faster than a slow twitch muscle fiber. And we know that it comes down to the cycling frequencies of the myosin heads that exist within a particular fiber. Okay, the higher the cycling frequency of a myosin head that exists within a fiber, the faster that muscle fiber is going to be able to shorten. And the lower the cycling frequency of the myosin heads that exist within a fiber, the slower that muscle fiber is going to be able to shorten. And it all, of course, deals with the speed of shortening with regard to the sarcomeres that exist within those fibers. So there's much more to this conversation. Now that we know that there are differences in the cycling frequencies of the myosin heads in fast versus slow twitch muscle fibers, there's something else that we really need to discuss, which is every single time that a myosin head cycles, we know that it consumes approximately 1 ATP. Okay? So every single time that the myosin head cycles, if it cycles one time, then the myosin head will consume approximately 1 ATP. Well, if the myosin heads within fast twitch muscle fibers can cycle 100 times over the course of a second, then how much ATP can they theoretically use over the course of a second? 100 ATP, right? Because every single time the myosin head cycles, if it cycles once, it'll consume 1 ATP. If it can cycle 100 times over the course of a second, then it has the ability, theoretically, to consume 100 ATP over the course of a second. Now compare that to slow twitch fibers. Inside of the slow twitch fibers, we know that the myosin heads, in my example, can cycle 50 times over the course of a second. What does that mean for the amount of ATP that the myosin heads within the slow twitch muscle fiber will consume over the course of a second? Each myosin head has the ability, theoretical ability, to consume then 50 ATP over the course of a second. If the myosin heads within slow twitch muscle fibers, in my example, can cycle 50 times over the course of a second, and every single time that they cycle, they consume 1 ATP, then they have, of course, the ability to consume approximately 50 ATP over the course of a second. And this should immediately tell you that there are huge differences in the rate at which fast and slow twitch muscle fibers consume ATP. So this leads us right back to the prior image. On the top, this is a sarcomere that exists within a fast twitch muscle fiber. On the bottom, this is a sarcomere that exists within a slow twitch muscle fiber. Okay? Now, let's look inside of the fast twitch muscle fiber. Okay? If we look inside of the fast twitch muscle fiber, we know that the myosin heads, in my example, can all cycle 100 times over the course of a second, and thus every single myosin head has the theoretical capability to consume 100 ATP over the course of a second. If we look inside of the slow twitch muscle fiber, we find the myosin heads, and each one of them can theoretically cycle 50 times over the course of a second, and thus each myosin head within the slow twitch muscle fiber can theoretically consume 50 ATP over the course of a second. Now, what does all of this mean? If we compare the fast to the slow twitch muscle fiber, since the myosin heads can cycle at such higher frequencies, the fast twitch muscle fiber will shorten much, much faster than the slow twitch muscle fiber will. Okay, so that's the first and obvious thing that we've already discussed. Now, the second huge thing here is, since the myosin heads within the fast twitch fiber cycle at such a higher frequency, which allows the fast twitch fiber to shorten faster, the fast twitch fiber is also going to consume way more ATP. Okay? Because all these myosin heads have the ability to cycle 100 times over the course of a second and thus consume 100 ATP over the course of a second. So yeah, the fast twitch muscle fiber can shorten way faster than the slow twitch muscle fiber, but the fast twitch fiber is also going to consume way more ATP over time, right? The fast twitch muscle fiber, in my example, is easily going to consume double the amount of ATP compared to the slow twitch muscle fiber over the same amount of time, right? Why? Because in the slow twitch muscle fiber, the myosin heads, all those myosin heads that you're looking at, right? All these myosin heads, they can only cycle 50 times over the course of a second, and thus each one of them can only consume approximately 50 ATP over the course of a second. So yeah, the slow twitch muscle fiber will shorten faster. Sorry. Yeah, the slow twitch muscle fiber will shorten slower, right? The myosin heads cycle at a lower frequency, so the slow twitch muscle fiber will shorten much more slowly because the myosin heads cycle at low frequencies, but the slow twitch muscle fiber will also consume much less ATP over time, right? Because each one of these myosin heads within the slow twitch fiber can only consume approximately 50 ATP per second. And you compare that to the myosin heads within the fast twitch fiber, where each one of them can theoretically consume 100 ATP over the course of a second. So there's a big overarching point to make here, and that is fast twitch muscle fibers shorten way faster than slow twitch muscle fibers do, right? It deals with the myosin head cycling frequency. But additionally, fast twitch muscle fibers consume way more ATP than slow twitch muscle fibers do, right? So the myosin head cycling frequency is great, for the fact that it allows the fast twitch muscle fiber, to shorten so fast, but at the same time, the fast twitch fiber has a much higher ATP demand than the slow twitch muscle fiber does. And this leads to some pretty big differences that we see with regard to metabolism in fast versus slow twitch fibers. This part I'm going to gloss over some because it's really more of a topic for like exercise physiology than it is for this course, but we'll still talk about it on a real basic level. Okay, so we know that fast twitch muscle fibers, okay, they're the ones over here on the right. That should have an X instead of a B. We know that fast twitch muscle fibers shorten very fast and consume huge quantities of ATP over the course of a short period of time. So if you look over here, there's this myosin ATPase activity. That just basically means that fast twitch muscle fibers consume a very high quantity of ATP over a short period of time. Here you can see, thanks to that, they have a very fast speed of contraction, right? The fast twitch muscle fibers shorten very, very fast, fast speed of contraction, thanks to the very high myosin ATPase activity that they have, meaning that the myosin heads cycle at high frequencies. Now, what this means is that fast twitch muscle fibers have to be able to produce lots of ATP over a short period of time, right? Because fast twitch muscle fibers shorten really fast, right? Thanks to the very high cycling frequency of their myosin heads. But that also means that they consume huge quantities of ATP over short periods of time. So they have to make huge quantities of ATP over short periods of time. And ultimately what you find out is the way that they try to do this is through what we would call fast or anaerobic metabolic systems. Fast twitch muscle fibers are much more so designed to make their ATP through anaerobic or fast glycolysis in the phosphagen system. Okay, those are the systems. If you go back, again, I'm kind of glossing over this because it's so far from the beginning. You have to go so far back to the beginning of the semester to make sense of this. And some of you are going to be more interested in doing this than others. So all I want you to get out of this is that fast twitch muscle fibers consume much more ATP over short periods of time than slow twitch muscle fibers do, right? For obvious reasons. And thus the fast twitch muscle fibers have to be able to make enormous quantities of ATP over short periods of time. And the way that they do that is through using the systems that can make lots of ATP over short periods of time. We tried to go through that in the first couple weeks of this course, but even that, there was much more that could have been said due to a lack of time. The systems that could make lots of ATP over short periods of time were like fast, otherwise known as anaerobic glycolysis, and the phosphagen system. And what I'm telling you about faster twitch fibers is that they rely heavily upon those systems. So here are slow twitch muscle fibers. What do we know about slow twitch muscle fibers? Their myosin ATPase activity is very low, meaning that the myosin heads within slow twitch muscle fibers don't cycle at a high frequency, and thus they don't consume tons of ATP over short periods of time. What does that translate into? A slow speed of contraction. Okay, so we know that slow twitch muscle fibers shorten slowly thanks to the fact that their myosin heads don't cycle at high frequencies. And since their myosin heads don't cycle at very high frequencies, meaning that their myosin ATPase activity is low, that means they also don't consume much ATP over time, especially compared to fast twitch fibers. Okay, so if slower twitch fibers shorten slowly and thus don't consume a ton of ATP over time, then they don't have to make a ton of ATP over time. And now what you'll see is in slow twitch muscle fibers, they're built to have systems that don't make a lot of ATP over short periods of time. Inside of slow twitch muscle fibers, what you'll see is there's tons of mitochondria inside of the muscle, inside of the slow twitch fibers themselves. There's what's called a lot of capillary density, meaning there's lots of blood vessels that go to slow twitch muscle fibers, which means lots of oxygen can be brought to slow twitch muscle fibers. So lots of oxygen is brought to slow twitch muscle fibers. Inside, there's lots of mitochondria. All of this, you take all this together, and what does it mean about slow twitch muscle fibers? They're very good at making ATP through that process that's called oxidative phosphorylation, right? They're very good at making ATP in their mitochondria. They receive lots of oxygen. They have lots of mitochondria inside of them. They're very good at making ATP in the mitochondria through the electron transport chain, right? That's how we make ATP through this process called oxidative phosphorylation. I won't go back through all that again either. Go back to the lectures from the beginning of the class if again you really want to know about this and tie everything together, but you don't have to. Okay? So anyways, that whole system of making ATP in the mitochondria, it's a much slower means of making ATP. You can make a lot more ATP per macronutrient molecule through that process, but the speed at which ATP can be made through oxidative phosphorylation is quite slow compared to like the phosphagen system in anaerobic or fast glycolysis. But that's perfectly fine for slow twitch muscle fibers, right? Because they don't have very high ATP demands, so they can rely on these systems that don't make lots of ATP over short periods of time. So this is the overarching point. When you compare fast to slow twitch muscle fibers, you find that fast twitch muscle fibers consume much more ATP over short periods of time than slow twitch muscle fibers do, for obvious reasons. Now, hopefully they're obvious. And ultimately, if fast twitch muscle fibers consume so much more ATP over short periods of time than slow twitch muscle fibers do, then fast twitch muscle fibers have to be designed and built to produce tons of ATP over short periods of time compared to slow twitch muscle fibers, which don't need to do that. Right? They can make smaller amounts of ATP over shorter periods of time, and they'll be just fine. So that is why we see faster twitch fibers much more so primed to use the phosphagen system and anaerobic or fast glycolysis, and slow twitch muscle fibers more so primed to utilize oxidative phosphorylation, right? Making ATP in their mitochondria. They're designed and built to utilize systems that make ATP at different rates. And this doesn't mean, by the way, just to be clear, there's so much more. We go on, there's an entire course that's called like exercise metabolism in our department. And that's 16 weeks of discussing nothing but this. So I could talk about this forever. But you have to realize, like, fast twitch muscle fibers, they still use oxidative phosphorylation. It's just not the dominant system. Slow twitch muscle fibers still have the capacity to run something like, fast or anaerobic glycolysis in the phosphagen system, but it's not the primary system that they utilize. So please don't think that this means that these systems are exclusive to fast or slow twitch muscle fibers. That's not how it works, right? It's just that depending upon what the ATP demand is in a faster versus a slower twitch fiber, that's going to dictate which one of these systems is built to be dominant inside of that fiber. And there's one more very important thing to say here, which is, what about fatigue? What about fatigue? Like, do slow twitch muscle fibers fatigue easily? Do fast twitch muscle fibers fatigue easily? And the answer is, really slow twitch muscle fibers, like the slowest of the slow twitch muscle fibers, probably really don't ever fatigue. Like right now, whether you're sitting or laying down, you've got slow twitch muscle fibers in some of your muscles that are contracting in a full state of tetanus. And they can continue to do that for hours straight, and they don't fatigue. Really slow twitch muscle fibers, they just don't fatigue. And the answer for this, we think, is because, well, their ATP demands are so low, right? Because the myosin head cycling frequency is so low that the ATP demands inside of those fibers, the slowest twitch fibers, can very easily be met. So they just don't fatigue. Now, faster twitch fibers fatigue really easily. First of all, fast twitch muscle fibers, really fast twitch fibers, aren't recruited until you're starting to do some pretty high intensity exercise or high intensity physical activity. We know this through the size principle. So these don't really fast twitch fibers don't tend to come into play unless you are doing something that's quite strenuous. Now, once they're recruited, they tend to fatigue quite easily. And we think that the major reason for this is because their ATP demands are so high. They have such high ATP demands that even those fast systems that they use, like faster anaerobic glycolysis and the phosphagen system, especially fast glycolysis, like they just can't meet the ATP demands of the fiber. Like maybe the phosphagen system can, but then the phosphagen system runs out after a couple seconds, and faster anaerobic glycolysis by itself is not enough to meet the highest ATP demands of these muscle fibers. And since the ATP demand of these fibers is higher than supply, these faster twitch fibers tend to fatigue very easily. Because this goes all the way back to the beginning of the semester too, but if the ATP demand of a fiber is higher than the production of ATP, then the byproducts of ATP hydrolysis will accumulate, and we think that those cause fatigue. So, big picture, slow twitch muscle fibers, especially the slowest slow twitch muscle fibers, are incredibly fatigue resistant. They don't really fatigue. They have very low ATP demands, and their ATP demands can be easily met. Compare that to faster twitch fibers. They have enormously high ATP demands, which probably can't be met for long periods of time, and thus they fatigue quite easily. So we can finish off this fast to slow twitch muscle fiber conversation by saying the number of fast to slow twitch muscle fibers that somebody is born with is purely genetics. Some people are born with a much higher quantity of very fast twitch muscle fibers, and some people are born with a very high quantity of very slow twitch muscle fibers. And then most people are actually born with the type of muscle fiber mostly that we didn't discuss, which is kind of the intermediate fiber that exists in between. So the number of fast to slow twitch muscle fibers that somebody has is really based upon who their parents are. And unfortunately, and mostly unequivocally, that's also going to determine how good they are at a particular sport. People with lots of fast twitch muscle fibers, you have to think about what that means. Like, they have muscle fibers that can shorten at very high velocities, very fast velocities, and they tend to be very fast and very quick. And there's much more to say about these muscle fibers too. They're incredibly what's called powerful, which means they can produce lots of force over time, which is an entirely different conversation. They're good at sports that require, let's say, lots of quickness, coupled with strength too. So, like certain positions in football, like a linebacker or a running back, or certain positions in soccer, like, being a forward, certain positions in volleyball, certain positions in basketball, really almost all of them, actually, in those sports. People that are born with more of these really fast twitch fibers just tend to be better at these sports. And there's really nothing that can be done about it. By that I mean, if somebody is born with a very large quantity of slow twitch muscle fibers, there's really no ability to get all of those slow twitch muscle fibers to be more like fast twitch muscle fibers. People born with a very high quantity of slow twitch muscle fibers, which shorten, very slowly compared to fast twitch muscle fibers, are just never going to be great at being something like a running back in football or a forward in soccer. They don't have the muscle fiber type that is really necessary for being successful in that sort of position. And they can really train all they want. They can get some of their slower twitch fibers to behave and look a little bit more like fast twitch muscle fibers, but they're never going to reach the, let's say, elite level in that particular position. If somebody's born with mostly slow twitch muscle fibers and they really want to be, like I said, a running back in football, they can train their entire lives and practice and practice and practice to be a running back in football, and maybe they even, to some degree become one, but it's impossible for someone like that to really, for the most part, reach, let's say, in an elite level in that particular position, because they don't have the fiber type that's really necessary for it. And this makes it sound like I'm just purely disadvantaging people with lots of slow twitch muscle fibers, which is silly, because there are lots of athletic events that require lots of slow twitch muscle fibers. Anything that you think about with regard to endurance, right? Cross-country running, marathon running, cycling, these are all events and sports that are endurance-based. And people that are born with lots of slow twitch muscle fibers are going to be much, much, much better at these events than people who are born with mostly fast twitch muscle fibers. Now, somebody with lots of fast twitch muscle fibers, if they really, want to, let's say, be an elite level marathon runner, okay, they could train and train their entire lives and probably get pretty good at marathon running. But because of the fact that they were born with mostly fast twitch muscle fibers, they're just never going to be an elite marathon runner. They do not have the predominant muscle fiber type that's necessary for being an elite level marathon runner, somebody that wins the Boston Marathon. It's just not going to happen, and it doesn't happen. There is an enormous genetic variable to success in sports. And I'm not saying people can't overcome it to some degree. Like, People with lots of fast or lots of slow twitch muscle fibers, and they're born that way, they can get pretty good at sports and events that they theoretically shouldn't be very good at. What I'm saying is those people are never going to be, they're never going to reach, let's say, a truly elite level within that sport. The last thing that I am going to talk to you about are different types of muscle contractions. This is something you would have learned about in anatomy, and it's something that we will discuss very briefly here as well. Talking about these different types of muscle contractions is really complicated, so I'm going to keep it as brief as possible. I'm just going to give you a definitional component to this, but please know there's so much more to this as well. There are courses that are called structural or kinetic anatomy courses, where quite literally the entire 16 weeks is dedicated to understanding what are called concentric, eccentric, and isometric contractions of different skeletal muscles throughout the body. Okay. I used to teach these types of courses, so it's difficult for me to go through this in 2 minutes, but that's what I'm going to do. So every muscle is capable of doing this. Every skeletal muscle in the human body can produce what are called concentric and eccentric contractions. You have to do something first, which is define what a contraction is. A contraction just means that a muscle produces force. That's it. So what does that actually mean? If a muscle is producing force, then the muscle fibers within it are producing force. Where does the force come from within the muscle fibers? It comes from the interaction of myosin and actin. That's all a contraction is. A muscle contraction means that a muscle is generating force. Now, a muscle can be generating force in 2 different circumstances. Really 3, but we'll get to that at the end. A muscle can generate force. It can contract while it shortens, or a muscle can generate force. It can contract while it lengthens. If a muscle contracts while it shortens, it's called a concentric contraction. Unfortunately, this is the type of contraction that everybody thinks about with every single skeletal muscle in the human body, and it generates enormous amounts of confusion. Okay, but again, story for another day. A concentric contraction means that a muscle contracts while it shortens, period. An eccentric contraction means a muscle contracts, generates force, while it lengthens. Now, what's being depicted in this image are concentric and eccentric contractions, and we don't have the time, like I said, to get into all of this, but this is the basics of it. When the biceps muscle concentrically contracts, when it contracts while it shortens, it produces what's called elbow flexion. And everybody thinks that the biceps muscle, the only thing that most people know about is the concentric contraction of the biceps muscle, which is that the biceps muscle, when it concentrically contracts, it contracts while it shortens, it can produce elbow flexion. Great. But the biceps muscle can also eccentrically contract. And eccentric contractions almost always happen after concentric contractions. The biceps muscle can also contract while it lengthens, right? And if the biceps muscle is lengthening, then the elbow must actually be producing extension, right? So the biceps muscle can also contraction, generate force, while it lengthens. And that happens actually when the elbow is in a state of extension, right? You're actually producing elbow extension while the biceps muscle is lengthening. And this is called an eccentric contraction. The biceps muscle contracts while it lengthens in order to allow for elbow extension to occur. The purpose of eccentric contractions in life, we don't just do this with weightlifting. It happens all the time throughout daily living. Eccentric contractions generally happen after concentric contractions. And it's to allow whatever object has been lifted to kind of slowly fall with gravity. Right? So what's being depicted here is a dumbbell. right? And what is the person doing? They are contracting their biceps muscle concentrically, right? The biceps muscle is contracting while it's shortening to produce elbow flexion. And the purpose of the dumbbell being there is to kind of resist the biceps muscle's concentric contraction, which can then damage it and cause hypertrophy and so forth and so on. Okay, but after the biceps muscle concentrically contracts while it shortens to lift that dumbbell during a state of elbow flexion, the biceps muscle will continue to contract. And as it contracts, the elbow will actually move into a state of extension, right? The elbow will begin to extend while the biceps muscle is still contracting and it's lengthening. And that actually allows for the weight, the dumbbell in this case, to slowly fall with gravity. Right? This prevents the weight from just slamming onto the floor. Nobody should be doing that in the gym, right? After a concentric contraction, when you bring the dumbbell up to your chest, you shouldn't just let the weight fall on the ground. Right? It's terrible for the dumbbell and for the gym. All that's very expensive, and the last thing you should be doing is dropping it. Right? So what happens? You slowly allow for the weight to fall back down with gravity. And what's happening is your biceps muscle is still contracting, but it's contracting while it's lengthening to allow for that dumbbell to fall with gravity. And while the dumbbell is falling with gravity, what's actually happening at the elbow? The elbow is extending. So as you allow for this weight to fall with gravity, the elbow is extending and the biceps muscle is lengthening. But the biceps muscle is still contracting and generating force, which is what's actually allowing for you to slowly allow that weight to fall with gravity and not rapidly fall, because the biceps muscle is still generating force and relaying that force onto the tendons and onto the bones. So force is still being generated, and that's allowing for that weight to slowly fall with gravity. Okay, that's called an eccentric contraction, when a muscle contracts while it lengthens. These eccentric contractions happen with all of our skeletal muscles all the time throughout the vast majority of movements that we do, whether it's with weights or not. Okay, so I will leave you with this with regard to concentric and eccentric contractions. The definitional thing is easy because anybody can memorize this. You can say the biceps, any muscle, if it contracts while it shortens, it's called a concentric contraction. If it contracts while it lengthens, it's called an eccentric contraction. Easy enough thing to remember. But to actually apply it to the human body is a whole different conversation. And it's far more complicated. Here's, again, like I said, this is what I'll leave you with. What you'll hear is when the biceps muscle contracts, it produces elbow flexion. That's partly true, but it's also partly incorrect because it's missing 50% of the conversation. When the biceps muscle contracts, it doesn't just produce elbow flexion. To say this correctly, it would be when the biceps muscle concentrically contracts, it produces elbow flexion. Right? When the biceps muscle contracts while it shortens, it produces elbow flexion. However, the biceps muscle can also contract while it lengthens, called an eccentric contraction. And if the biceps muscle contracts while it lengthens, called an eccentric contraction, if the biceps muscle eccentrically contracts, it can also produce elbow extension. Right? And again, this is usually for the purpose of slowly allowing an object to fall with gravity. So in the future, don't fall for being told that when the biceps muscle or any muscle contracts, it produces so and so, right? Because on a definitional level, there's more to it, right? What does the muscle do when it concentrically contracts, and what does the muscle do when it eccentrically contracts? Is the conversation that has to be had, and that's where a whole separate class comes into play. The last contraction that I'm going to go through with you is an easy one. It's called an isometric contraction on the top. In isometric contraction, all it means is that a muscle contracts, right? It generates force, but the muscle then doesn't change its length. It stays exactly the same length while it's contracting and thus generating force. So imagine you go over and you try to lift up a counter, right? That's glued and nailed to the floor. It's not going to happen. You're going to go over to the counter and your biceps muscle is going to start generating force. And you're going to try to lift the counter, but the counter is way too heavy. It's nailed to the floor. You're not going to be able to overcome the weight of the counter to be able to lift it. So what will happen is the biceps muscle will contract. It'll generate force, but it won't change its length, right? This will happen when you try to lift any object that's much too heavy. You'll go over to the object and you'll try to lift the object, but the object is too heavy, so you can't overcome the weight of the object. So what will happen is muscles will contract to try to lift the object, but since you can't overcome the weight of the object, the muscles will contract while not changing their length whatsoever. Right? That's an isometric contraction, when a muscle contracts but doesn't change its length. Now you can also do isometric contractions without trying to lift really heavy objects. For example, you could contract your biceps muscle right now and not have elbow flexion or extension happen. Okay, think of somebody contracting their biceps muscle to show off or whatever, in a gym setting, whatever the case might be, right? The biceps muscle is contracting, and they're contracting their biceps muscle to show you the size of their biceps muscle. But neither elbow flexion or extension is occurring, right? It's just static. That is an isometric contraction too. The biceps muscle is contracting while not changing its length. So we have to call that an isometric contraction. But the difference is, in that circumstance, you actually need the antagonistic muscle, the triceps muscle, the antagonist muscle, the triceps muscle to contract too, to ensure that there's actually no joint action that happens. So we can produce isometric contractions on our own if we want to, like without going over to really heavy objects that we can't actually lift and trying to lift them. We can isometrically contract any muscle in our body right now if we want to. Like you could isometrically contract your quadricep, hamstring, whatever muscle you want. You could contract it without changing its length, but you would need the antagonistic muscle to be contracting simultaneously to ensure that that muscle actually doesn't change its length. So that's the difference there between those two different ways that isometric contractions can happen. Definitional level, which I'm sure is probably most of you are interested in. Isometric contraction means that a muscle contracts and doesn't change its length. One more definitional thing. Concentric and eccentric contractions fall under the category of isotonic. Concentric and eccentric contractions are both what are called isotonic contractions. And what an isotonic contraction means is that tension or force remains the same while the length of the muscle changes. So in our example, the biceps muscle is producing a fairly consistent amount of force. And while it's producing that consistent amount of force or tension, again, means the same thing, it's changing its length. Right? During the concentric contraction, when the biceps muscle is contracting while it's shortening, it's maintaining a fairly consistent amount of force. And when the biceps muscle is contracting while it's lengthening, it's also maintaining a fairly consistent amount of force while it's changing its length. Right? That's what the definition of an isotonic contraction is. And yet again, both concentric and eccentric contractions fall into this category of isotonic. And this finally brings the discussion of skeletal muscle to an end.